that. Well, Gail, our guest speaker, was very involved last year, along with John and Joanne, who are both here today, but others as well, in planning and putting on the Leicester International Conference. I felt very gratified because in one of the introductory talks, I think that Gail gave, she praised the George Eliot Fellowship as being an example of what literary societies ought to be. It was lovely to hear that, particularly when you spend many hours into the middle of the night preparing things or getting things ready for the fellowship. So thank you, Gail, for your appreciation of what we do. The title of Gail's talk, which you will all have seen, of course, George Eliot's Network of Readers. And I suppose we're part of a network, almost within a network. We have the fellowship, and then we have this group who are meeting specifically today to hear Gail. Gail, I don't know how she finds the time to prepare this for us, because I'm sure she's working ferociously hard in her job at Reading, as all university lecturers and professors and people are. So thank you very much, Gail, for your time, and we look forward very much to hearing what you have to say. So over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks everyone for this invitation. It was a huge pleasure to work with John and the rest of you last year when we celebrated George Eliot's bicentenary, and I was just spending quite a lot of this year thinking, thank goodness she was born in 1819, not 1820, because that would have been a bit of a nightmare. It's a huge honour, and it's very humbling to be giving this lecture, following in some extraordinary footsteps of some very illustrious previous lecturers, some of whom are in the audience today. And it's a particular pleasure to be giving this lecture as the fellowship approaches its 90th anniversary. It's a massive achievement, and it owes a lot to your devotion and dedication to supporting Eliot and Eliot studies over the years, and many people have great cause to be enormously grateful to John and indeed to the rest of you. So I've kind of had a relationship with George Eliot for quite a long time. I'm from the West Midlands rather than Nuneaton, but I do remember very distinctly reading a very abridged version, I think, of The Mill on the Floss at my local library, which still, thank goodness, is in existence. I still remember the cover of it and being very enthralled by Eliot, and the delight of growing up alongside her, knowing that she was from the Midlands too, was terrific. And I've been spending quite a lot of time. I suppose she's been in each of the books I've written, and she's very much at the centre of the current research I'm doing. So part of that is informing part of the lecture I'm giving today. As you'll know, the fellowship's founder, Mr. A.F. Cross, deliberately chose fellowship as a term that best described his aspirations for this new group, and not society, for which there are lots of literary precedents. As Kathleen Adams wrote in 2000, fellowship was his own personal choice of title, since its meaning for him seemed to be most suited to admirers of a woman who still had a message for present and future generations. So there's clearly something inherent in that term that conveyed an enduring quality suitable for maintaining Eliot's name. Kathleen Adams' own history of the fellowship chooses a different collective noun in its title, a community of interest, which has echoes of a more actively demanding community of practice, and which again emphasises a form of collective responsibility. Society perhaps comes to seem a slightly effete term and not quite up to the aspirations of George Eliot's readers. What was never in question was that the fellowship be termed a network, though many of us now belong to a number of networks, usually professional and often using online media as their modes of communication. So what I want to think about today is the concept of the network, which I guess in the title should really have quotation marks around it, alongside other collective nouns, and how they work in terms of thinking about Eliot's contemporary readers. And I'll use the example of Adam Bede to examine how a group of readers begins to evolve and what the mechanisms are behind that novel's great popular as well as its critical success. So essentially I'm using Adam Bede as an exemplar of how a Victorian reading audience gets created. So that's the bulk of the lecture, really, just thinking about Adam Bede and its moment of publication and shortly afterwards. And as a coda, I'll go on to think about the usefulness of the concept of the network for Victorian and modern readers and scholars, and how it works alongside other nouns of collective activity and identity in Eliot's work. So I think I'm going to be speaking for about 40 minutes. I hope it's not longer than that. And I can't see what you're doing. I'm looking at my lecture. So if you want to go and have a cup of tea or play with your phone, that's fine. Yeah. So Adam Bede was published on the 1st of February. It's actually published rather later than it should have been. It was meant to have been published months earlier, but had been held up by Edward Bulwer-Lytton's tardiness in correcting the proofs of his 4-volume novel, What Will He Do With It?, written whilst he was Secretary of State for the Colonies. The thought of Dominic Raab coming up with a novel is a chilling one, so I'm going to pass over that one pretty quickly. Before Adam Bede's publication, Eliot Lewis and John Blackwood were trying to secure the terms of its success by arranging appropriate marketing and critical negotiations. At this point, of course, Lewis was by far the more experienced writer of the pair, and he was crucial in negotiating the terms of publication for Eliot's work with the Blackwoods, by then a very well-established company who published leading writers, including Margaret Oliphant and Anthony Trollope, and whose periodical Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, which is very familiar to all of us, was founded in 1817. But just as crucial for Eliot was John Blackwood's own generous concern for his nervous and insecure writer, and the affability and shrewdness he applied in helping to negotiate the tough business of publishing for her. One immediate issue to be faced was the predominant position of Moody's circulating library in determining work's success. Readers had been borrowing books from Moody's since 1842, but the company's move to Oxford Street in 1851 had massively increased its influence and significance, which often extended to the content of the books it lent. In 1858, according to Judith Flanders, Moody's bought 100,000 new books, a figure which nearly doubled to 180,000 3 years later. Mindful of Moody's power, Eliot had queried anxiously why Moody has almost always left the CS, Seeds of Clerical Life, out of his advertised list, although he puts in very trashy and obscure books. I hope it is nothing more than chance. With Adam Bede, Moody was trying to drive a very hard bargain, initially threatening to take only 50 copies, but finally succumbing, to use John Blackwood's term, to taking 500 at our terms of 10% off sales, to which I think he's entitled when he takes so large a number. Blackwood was finally satisfied with Moody's decision, not least because, as he wrote to Lewis, he understood the lender's caution. As I have often explained before, he wrote, I felt distinctly that by Clerical Scenes, a reputation with readers and men of letters was made, but not a public general reputation. When the reviews begin to appear and people who've read Adam Bede begin to talk about it, the movement will take place. So we can see here Blackwood's careful attention to the mechanics of popularity, the need to create an audience that would communicate its enthusiasm, the need to gauge audiences and to try to effect the best response. Blackwood's assessment, of course, proved correct, not least because he was, as he said, sending copies to the press in all directions, and the press, as we'll see, was crucial in achieving the novel's reputation. Blackwood's publicity and marketing work was perhaps more tricky with Adam Bede than other novels he'd worked on. And as the year progressed, Blackwood and Eliot discovered how the market responded to this new work, and indeed how she began to create a market for a new type of thoughtfully engaged, serious fiction that reviewers came to recognise in Adam Bede. As they awaited its publication, Blackwood and Eliot discussed their expectations for the novel in terms of its popularity, a word which crops up throughout the year in their discussions of her work and that of her contemporaries, including Darwin, whose On the Origin of Species came out in November and almost immediately sold out its first edition. Blackwood wrote that Adam Bede can never come under the class of popular, agreeable stories, though those who love power, real humour and true natural description will stand by the sturdy carpenter. And Eliot described her hope for the novel in these terms. I perceive that I have not the characteristics of the popular author, and yet I am much in need of the warmly expressed sympathy which only popularity can win. So there's a distinction here in their views of the popularity of the agreeable, non-threatening writer of popular fiction, and a deeper popularity, which Eliot articulates, the love of the people, which is rather a characteristic of the affection gained by writing than a generic measure of the fiction itself. We can see an interesting distinction, I think, between the person of the author and the writing. Blackwood writes about the characteristics of Adam Bede, Eliot writes about herself. So as the year progressed, Blackwood's use of the term popularity shifted, as the success of Adam Bede began to redefine what a popular novel looked like, and arguably the concept of popularity itself. With this novel, Eliot takes Victorian fiction into a new phase of psychological complexity via a deeply moral, realistic aesthetic and an ambitious reading practice that demanded not only serious critical attention, but a degree of committed, empathetic investment. In the novel's early reviews, we can see how, out of very familiar materials, she was perceived to be developing a new mode of fiction. As literary professionals, Eliot and Lewis were avidly concerned with how Adam Bede might be reviewed, by whom, and how it would fare alongside more overtly popular novels. An early review from The Statesman disgusted and disheartened Lewis as he wrote, "It was laudatory throughout, but the kind of laudation was fatal. The nincompoop couldn't see the distinction between Adam and the mass of novels he's been reading." Eliot herself was anxious about too damnatory praise from ignorant journalists, and she charged Blackwood with making sure that no hackneyed, puffing phrase be tacked to her book in advertising columns. She goes on in a letter of 25th of February, "One sees such phrases garnishing every other advertisement of the popular publisher Hurston Blackett's trash. Surely no being above the rank of an idiot can have his inclination coerced by them, and it would gall me as much as any trifle could to see my book recommended by such an authority as the writer in Bell's Weekly Messenger who doesn't know how to write decent English." Eliot may well then have been dismayed at the first review of Adam Bede, which appeared in the John Bull and Britannia. It was less than glowing, made no mention at all of its hero, and concentrated entirely on Hetty's attractions as a popular heroine. However, Adam Bede did go on to become the most widely reviewed novel of the year and to receive due recognition of its innovations, its complexity, and its new demands on readers. Reviews appeared throughout the year in national and regional publications and were quick to acknowledge Adam Bede's success. Rather differently to now, of course, when reviews come out immediately on a novel's appearance, reviews were still appearing in the autumn. But as early as the 26th of February, the Saturday Review was advising that persons who only read one novel a year, and it is seldom that more than one really good novel is published in a year, may venture to make their selection and read Adam Bede. And in the Edinburgh Review, an anonymous Caroline Norton judged that the novelist has every reason to feel proud that the universal question in men's mouths in the pause between topics of war and politics is, have you read Adam Bede? Like the war for Italian independence, that year's general election, and voting reform, Adam Bede took its place as one of the key events of 1859. And the person of Adam himself partly enables this identification with the contemporary moment through reviewers welcoming him as no ideal creation, no figment of a writer's brain, as one of ourselves, lighting up some English hearth and home, for truly English is our friend Adam. And for Geraldine Dewsbury in the Athenaeum, Adam revealed the secret of the substantial worth of England, the secret of her strength. It is not the number of men and women with brilliant reputations and lyrically recognised name and fame that makes the enduring prosperity of a nation, but it lies in the amount of worth that is unrecognised, that remains dumb and unconscious of itself, not clever, but with a certain honest stupidity that understands nothing but doing its best and doing its work without shirking any portion of it. Adam was welcomed, Caroline Norton wrote, as a true model of the noble, simple, self-relying type to be found, as Wordsworth's lines in the epigraph to this remarkable novel expresses it, among nature's unambitious underwood and flowers that prosper in the shade. As these lines from Wordsworth's The Excursion suggest, the recognition of the value of an unambitious, unself-conscious life was not a new phenomenon. But it was to achieve greater political and social purchase in 1859, and arguably Adam Bede helped prepare the audience for Samuel Smiles's Self-Help, which appeared in November. As the Glasgow Herald stated, Adam Bede had the hands of a carpenter and the head of a gentleman. So the Englishness of the novel itself begins to form a collective readerly identity, and it's manifest too in Adam Bede's rural setting, which is coterminous with the past that Eliot conjures up so effectively and which reviewers responded to with great nostalgia. After congratulating the male novelist, a rare man of genius in a world dominated by female novelists, for his ability to write a work that is in keeping with the actual world, The Economist's reviewer states that after a course of the feverish, self-critical, posted up to the latest dates novels of the present day, Reading Adam Bede is like paying a visit from town to the open hillsides, pure air and broad sunshine of the country which it describes. The review echoes a private letter that is quite a famous letter now, which you might have read, that Jane Welsh Carlyle wrote to the author of Adam Bede, whose identity at that time she didn't know, saying that reading the novel was as good as going into the country for one's health, that it was like a visit to her childhood home of Scotland, minus the fatigues of the long journey and the grief of seeing old friends grow old and places that knew me, knowing me no more. I could fancy in reading it to be seeing and hearing once again a crystal clear musical Scotch stream, such as I long to lie down beside and cry out for gladness and sadness after long stifling sojourn in the south, where there is no water but what is stagnant or muddy. The rural setting of the novel blends with the attractiveness of its characters to achieve a harmonious pattern that surprises reviewers into finding those humble characters, including farmers and blacksmiths, sympathetic realities, rather than mere lay figures, as the Saturday Review puts it, on which authors hang their old shooting jackets while they walk around in an evening dress smirking and pointing out how jolly and genial they are with their own old clothes. The Saturday Review instructs its readers whilst describing what it finds. It's universally agreed by reviewers that this is a very cohesive novel where event and incident, such as are found in the third volume, actually intrude on the symbiotic reflectiveness, setting and characters of the novel. The person who takes up most attention in the reviews is unquestionably Mrs. Poyser. For the Times, she is the pivot on which the plot revolves, the chorus who is continually intervening. She is, for most reviewers, a comic character, with the Times comparing her to Dickens's Sam Weller, Mrs. Gamp, or Mrs. Nickleby. But whilst she is someone whom more recent critics are more likely to overlook in their attention to other figures, every single contemporary review contains its favourite nugget of Mrs. Poyser's eminently quotable wisdom. The Edinburgh Review indeed devotes 6 long pages to her sayings. Indeed, her ability to be quoted, both in reviews and by other characters in the novel itself, is her preeminent feature and function. As the Times writes, her wisdom is always coming out, either spoken by herself or quoted by somebody else or mentioned by the author. And in this, the reviews thus enact and perpetuate Mrs. Poyser's primary role. And in doing so, they acknowledge a keystone of Eliot's writing, in that the quotation works by establishing and confirming familiarity with something that pre-exists. The act of quoting then enables a sympathetic recognition of a common viewpoint or shared experience, both within and then beyond the parameters of the novel. The reviewer Anne Mosley wonders, do any two people ever talk 3 minutes over this story without quoting with a particularly sly relish the definition of Mr. Ride's style of preaching, as though it met some case very near home, which out of respect or delicacy, they will not further indicate. And this is the quote of Mrs. Poyser's that she's referring to. She said, Mr. Owen was like a good meal of victual. You were the better for him without thinking on it. And Mr. Ride was like a dose of physic. He gripped and worrited you, and after all, he left you much the same. So the subject of a dull sermon may indeed have been a general one, but the quote makes it go home, as Mosley puts it, to each individual's business and bosom, and speaker and listener are thus both enabled both to build a link with their fellows through the bridge of the quotation, and also tacitly to acknowledge the emotional affect of the novel as grounded in its recognition and invoking of something already existing in the past, in the memory, quotation, which must be known in order to be quoted, in order to achieve its ends in the present. So Mrs. Poyser is absolutely at the heart of the novel's impact on and its amalgamation of its readers. This is, in Anne Mosley's perceptive review, intrinsic to the success of a novel which has found its way, as she puts it, into hands indifferent to all previous fiction, to readers who welcome it as the voice of their own experience in a sense no other book has ever been. Quotation, both within the novel and in reviews, acts out Mrs. Poyser's function as the heart of Hayslope's community in cementing a communal set of values which might even displace the centrality of the church through the novel's well-directed morals. The highlight of Mrs. Poyser's fame was her being cited in the House of Commons on the 8th of March, where she was quoted by the Liberal MP Charles Buxton in a debate on the Charles et Georges affair. The Charles et Georges was a French ship which was alleged to be involved in the slave trade. Buxton suggested that the Earl of Malmesbury, now that the case could be seen as a whole, would wish that his conduct, as the farmer's wife said in Adam Bede, could be hatched over again and hatched different. As the Blackwoods Review noted, this cemented Mrs. Poyser's position amongst British worthies. It also extended the novel's initial reach and confirmed in its affirmation through retrospection, which is fundamental to the act of quotation, the way in which the novel worked primarily through the medium of the past, which was both the novel's subject matter and its creative vehicle. Mrs. Poyser epitomises the country scenes in Adam Bede, looked back upon with an almost passionate tenderness, as though the senses ached for the genial old home, Mosley wrote, which is the end point of more than one readerly engagement with Adam Bede. Home, the past, country scenes, and thoughts which have been lying half-developed and struggling for expression in many minds are the heart of the novel's success in 1859. And Anne Mosley's review is a very sensitive and very good one, I think. So through reviews, readers who already share an identity through the site of the review, through the specific publication that they're reading, become joined with other groups, whether those groups have read or will go on to read the novel or not. Huge chunks of quotations in 19th century reviews might give an impression of having read the novel in question, and at least they might give private grounds for a conversation or recognition of a passing reference, which themselves go on to forge further links. One such is the mention of Adam in a fictional series called Journey to the North in the English Woman's Journal, which was published, of course, by some of Eliot's friends in September. So in this story, this fictionalized travel narrative, we read, "We stopped to see Bardon Tower in Yorkshire, which was being repaired, and there, whistling and planing, was a carpenter. Oh, how like Adam Bede, whispered A, clutching my arm convulsively. As I knew A's peculiar weakness for that individual and feared there might be a previous diner, I hurried her off." Anyone following parliamentary discussions might have heard reference to Mrs. Poyser, and Buxton wasn't the only politician to have read the novel. Blackwood sent Eliot a note that he'd received from Bulwer Lytton, praising Adam Bede's exquisite touches of beauty in the conception of the human character, and calling it one of the very ablest works of fiction I've read for years. By the end of the summer, by which point, of course, Eliot's own identity was known, Adam Bede was being read throughout the UK and Europe. Queen Victoria initially read the novel for herself and subsequently to her husband as he lay ill in bed in October, and she wrote to her daughter in Germany, "Dear Papa was much amused and interested by Adam Bede, which I am delighted to read a second time. There is such knowledge of human nature, such truth in the characters. I like to trace a likeness to the dear Highlanders in Adam and also in Elizabeth and Mrs. Poyser. I'm sure it is only a true picture of what constantly and very naturally happens." This is an unusually tolerant view of Hetty's situation. Returning from a trip to see his sons in Switzerland, Lewis wrote to report to Blackwood that Paris is in a fever about Adam Bede. Even at Hoffwell, 5 miles from Bern, with only half a dozen English boys, I heard of it. For on telling my second son, I'd brought him a novel, all 3 shouted, "Is it Adam Bede?" And Eliot and Lewis had returned from Europe to find a generous letter from Dickens, who, having determined to wait until I could write to you in person, now took the opportunity to address Eliot as "my dear madam," and to tell her how Adam Bede has taken its place among the actual experiences and endurances of my life. And in August, while travelling through the small Welsh town of Penman Moor, Lewis notes in his journal that even at this small station, we find a lady reading Adam Bede. Wherever we go, we see people reading it. So through judicious reviewing, the novel had gained significant publicity, but as now, its fame and popularity received a boost from book clubs and from more formal institutions. An article in the National Review on books of the quarter suitable for reading societies said that the novel evinces a deeper and wider genius than any novel we've read for years, with a touch of delicacy in the quiet descriptions that often reminds us of Goethe and great masculine vigour of imagination. The author combines a range of observation, an insight into character, and a humorous power which render his production a really lasting work of art. And the Era notes that all circulating libraries and book clubs may congratulate themselves on so brilliant an addition to their lists. It became so popular that in October, 10 copies of Adam Bede were amongst a number of books stolen from a bookseller in New Bond Street. Adam Bede enthralled, comforted, and challenged readers' expectations. And as one review notes, there is neither a monster, a villain, nor a hero in it, according to the usual sense. Hailed as an assured success by the summer, Adam Bede was constructing what we might think of as a national network of readers, a complex configuration which crossed class boundaries as well as geographical ones. And on the 1st of June, George Howard, the Earl of Carlisle, gave a speech at the opening of the new hall of the Saddleworth Mechanics and Literary Institute. He praised the wholesomeness of the enterprise, was particularly glad to encourage reading amongst the working classes, and interestingly asserted the place of fiction in their busy working lives. He said, this is in the report of his speech, "The mind cannot always remain on the full stretch, and I should regret very much any such pedantic and very rigorous regulations as would exclude books which the working classes might like to peruse on long winter evenings. Such wholesome works of fiction and entertainment, for instance, as Mary Barton, and one more recently published which is named Adam Bede. And I earnestly exhort everyone I now address, though it is a novel, to read the latter, for it contains some of the deepest searchings and appeals to the higher instincts of our nature that it ever fell to my lot to come across." With these words, George Howard is not only recommending an enlightening book to the working classes whom he addresses, but sharing his own reading experience with them, addressing them as equals in the field of literature, as potential co-readers, members of the same audience, and subject to the same range of experiences. It's both a covert instruction and an invitation which begins to break down barriers between readers and thus to fulfil Eliot's ambitions for her work. During a year when the government was painstakingly seeking ways to redefine political community and constituencies, and nations were reconfiguring boundaries and alliances, the arts provided the grounds for other alliances to be formed and groups to be defined. Audiences and consumers of culture created configurations along the lines of shared tastes, experiences, and responses, which might, as in theatrical audiences, be class-based or be far more disparate, such as those groups across Britain who read and enjoyed Adam Bede. So cultural experiences and literary text provide nodes of interconnection which might either coincide with or completely override more politically driven or economically determined configurations. What's apparent, however, is that in a period which celebrated the notable individual, there was also a pressing necessity to remap collective identities too, and that the arts were one of the media within which the drawing of lines of affinity was taking place. But do these lines of affinity draw up a network? I've been intrigued for a while about this term and how it's applied to the Victorian period. I think it's particularly after reading a fantastic book which Mary Shannon published in 2015. It's called Dickens, Reynolds and Mayhew on Wellington Street, The Print Culture of a Victorian Street, which some of you will know. It's a brilliant book about the extraordinary concentration of periodical offices and publishers around Wellington Street, which is a street that still exists in London between Strand and Covent Garden. And Mary's book asserts that Wellington Street is positioned at the heart of London's print networks, which themselves give rise to a networked way of working and socialising. It's a really eye-opening piece of work, a really good example of the ways in which cultural geography can really inform our work in literature. I'm not in any way seeking to question what Mary discovers and argues about the lives and work that are centred around this street, but I am very intrigued about the idea of the network and its applicability to the 19th century and how far the largely professional meanings of the term that we've produced quite recently can be applied to the Victorians. According to the OED, the use of network to mean an interconnected group of people or an organisation was first coined in 1947, which is just 7 years after networking was used to describe new possibilities for television. The OED quotes, "Television, now that a practicable means of networking has been developed, has been supplied with the final implement necessary for the creation of what will eventually be a nationwide service. Now, things may of course exist before the term for them is evolved. The Old Boy Network was surely present before the term was coined in 1959, and even before the term Old Boy to signify a former pupil at a school was first used in the title of Tom Brown's School Days by an Old Boy in 1857. But in the mid-19th century, network would have signified either something made, a work in which threads, wires, or similar materials are arranged in the fashion of a net, especially a light fabric made of netted threads, or a piece of work having the form or construction of a net, a collection or arrangement of something or things resembling a net, or this is all quoted from the OED, or something in nature that resembled a net, like structures in animals or plants, or a complex collection or system of rivers. So the root of the concept in the 19th century lies in something crafted, and then in the metaphors that emerge from that work. And we can see these uses exemplified in Eliot's quite sparing use of the term. In The Sad Fortunes of the Reverend Amos Barton, Mrs. Brick seems to have been given a network of wrinkles by age, as has Kester Bale in Adam Bede, the old man with a close leather cap and the network of wrinkles on his sun-browned face. Whereas Miss Rebecca Linnet's wrinkles and other features might be blurred through her veil, which is described as a Turnerian haze of network. The narrator of Adam Bede also describes a wire network window overlooking the garden at the Poysers farm. Another network is physical, a network of black tram lines in Felix Holt. But most of Eliot's later uses of the term represent metaphorical uses or psychological applications of the term. Lush ponders the network of possible paths that Grandcourt's actions might take. And in the same novel, Daniel Deronda experiences the printed words of a book as no more than a network through which he saw and heard everything as clearly as before, as he sits remembering his rescue of Myra. This is a full quotation. He sat up half the night, living again through the moments since he'd first discerned Myra on the river brink, with the fresh vividness which belongs to emotive memory. When he took up a book to try and dull this urgency of inward vision, the printed words were no more than a network through which he saw and heard everything as clearly as before, saw not only the actual events of 2 hours, but possibilities of what had been and what might be, which those events were enough to feed with the warm blood of passionate hope and fear. The network here seems, if anything, to be impeding connection, and Gwendolen, being forcibly courted by Grandcourt, is likened to a fish about to be devoured. A fish honestly invited to come and be eaten has a clear course in declining, but how if it finds itself swimming against a net? And apart from the network, would she have dared at once to say anything decisive? Gwendolen had not time to be clear on that point. And in Middlemarch, the network of Rosamond's cleverness traps Lydgate as money troubles and Rosamond's loss of her baby begin to overwhelm him. His superior knowledge and mental force, instead of being, as he'd imagined, a shrine to consult on all occasions, was simply set aside on every practical question. He'd regarded Rosamond's cleverness as precisely of the receptive kind which became a woman. He was now beginning to find out what that cleverness was. What was the shape into which it had run as into a close network, aloof and independent. No one quicker than Rosamond to see causes and effects which lay within the track of her own tastes and interests. It's one of the most chilling moments of the novel, I think. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the use of the word web is more prominent and often more promising in Eliot. The web is another natural image which has echoes in a made artifact, but one that may be made to encompass and connect. There are a few tangled webs, but unlike in that phrase's source, Walter Scott's Marmion, where he writes, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive," Eliot's tangles are generated by the mental and emotional confusion which for Daniel and Romola are the signs of confused human connection. After he meets his mother, Eliot writes of Daniel, "When fatigue from the strangely various emotion of the day at last sent Deronda to sleep, he remained undisturbed except by the morning dreams, which came as a tangled web of yesterday's events and finally waked him with an image drawn by his pressing anxiety." And Romola sits weary in the darkness with a tangled web in her mind after her last meeting with her brother, when she tries to make sense of his actions and those of Savonarola. But the web, of course, isn't a collective noun as such, but rather denotes the actions needed to weave relations and situations which might trap an unwary young doctor. Middlemarch again. Young lovemaking, that gossamer web. The web itself is made of spontaneous beliefs and indefinable joys, yearnings of one life towards another, visions of completeness, indefinite trust. and Lydgate fell to spinning that web from his inward self with wonderful rapidity. As for Rosamond, she was in the water lily's expanding wonderment at its own full of life, and she too was spinning industriously at the mutual web. It's interesting to reflect that networks and webs, or the web, have come to denote the structures that we largely live in now, especially this afternoon, in both our social and our professional lives. Indeed, as I was searching through the Gutenberg versions of Eliot's works to find these keywords, they often crop up in the footnotes about Gutenberg's websites and in the acknowledgement that Professor Michael Hart initiated Project Gutenberg with only a loose network of volunteer support. So what word might we use then to connote the band of readers that Eliot created through her writing and that Blackwood gathered together through his work as a publisher? Band won't do. Eliot only uses it in Romola and then only to describe groups of belligerent men. So perhaps we have to go back to where we started and that term so carefully chosen by Mr. A.F. Cross, fellowship. Apart from a scattering of references in Daniel Deronda, this does not refer to any kind of exclusive academic role when used by Eliot, but rather the apotheosis of human life, often achieved through suffering or the greatest sympathy with suffering. One instance occurs in what I think is one of the most moving scenes in all of Eliot's writing, when Mrs. Bulstrode stands by her husband in his disgrace. She was at his side in mournful but unreproaching fellowship with shame and isolation. And of course, at the end of The Mill on the Floss, Maggie and Tom cling together in fatal fellowship. But throughout her work, fellowship is the form that relationships take at their most intense, often in spite of circumstances, such as Janet Dempster and the Reverend Tryon's fellowship in suffering. And in The Mill on the Floss, it's sorrow that raises the bare offices of humanity into a bond of loving fellowship. Romola is not the only novel in which simple human fellowship expressed itself as a strongly felt bond. Indeed, it becomes the bedrock of all relations in Eliot's later work, on which love, friendship, religious ardour, general bonhomie are all based. Marriage with Dorothea might seem a kind of risky fellowship to the narrator at the start of Middlemarch, but it's Mr. Casaubon's lack of a sense of fellowship that dooms their marriage from the outset, and which ultimately leads Dorothea to fear binding herself to a fellowship from which she shrank. But conversely, it's through her need to express pitying fellowship rather than to rebuke Rosamond that enables her to learn the truth about Will's love for her. It's probably in Daniel Deronda that fellowship finds its climax, in the novel's multiple manifestations are examples of how fellowship binds and grounds both collective and individual identity. Deronda himself is one of the rarer sort who presently see their own frustrated claim as one among a myriad. The inexorable sorrow takes the form of fellowship and makes the imagination tender. Increasingly, sorrow becomes the vehicle of that empathy that's Eliot's hallmark and of which fellowship is its manifestation. The sense of fellowship can thrill from the near to the distant, and the fellowship with sorrow or with human travail, as Eliot puts it, traverses time too. It's finally firmly grounded for Daniel when he meets his mother and finds himself in the fellowship of your people, as his grandfather's friend Kalonymus puts it. And as the narrator reports Daniel himself is feeling later, it was as if he had found an added soul in finding his ancestry, his judgment no longer wandering in the mazes of impartial sympathy, but choosing, with that partiality which is man's best strength, the closer fellowship that makes sympathy practical, exchanging that bird's eye reasonableness which soars to avoid preference and loses all sense of quality for the generous reasonableness of drawing shoulder to shoulder with men of like inheritance. In Dorothea and in Daniel, fellowship finally confirms their sense of self in a form of connectedness with their fellow men and women, transmutes their benevolent desires into practical forms, and in both of their stories enables them to live beyond their own moment in a fellowship with the past and the future. The network, bound up with professionalism and enabled and limited by technology, is a vehicle for something more profound in Eliot's work and the experience of her readers. It's a means, not an end, and that experience finds itself in fellowship, surely a very appropriate term for the body of people still concerned to perpetuate Eliot's work still further. And that's it. Thank you.
Very nice.
He's silent clapping, it's gone sweet.
Thank you, Gail. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
It really was. I was particularly interested by those early examples of the reviews, because Victorians far longer, be much generous in the space that they gave to reviewing books than we manage now in our supposedly better educated times. But I mean, 6 pages about Mrs. Poyser in one review is amazing.
It is. I can't remember how long the review was. It's probably about 25, 30 pages. So it's a substantial review in itself. But yes, 6 pages of Mrs. Poyser quotes. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah. If those of you who would like to ask a question, Gail is happy to answer them or to have discussions. But I think you'll all need to unmute yourselves if you wish to raise a point.
Or you can put it in the chat. We've got my colleague Mary Morrissey, who's very, very kindly here to help John and I negotiate and navigate through Zoom. So Mary, what's the best thing to do? Is people putting their hands up or putting questions in the chat? Or
if they could just put in the chat that they have a question, and then John can take them one by one. John can invite them to ask the question then, I think.
Right. That.
Or if they just want to raise their hand on the screen, that might work either. We can keep an eye on raised hands.
thank you.
Joanna.
Thank you, Gail. I found that absolutely fascinating in so many ways, particularly as John has highlighted the frequency with which reviewers rather, focused on Mrs. Poyser. And it seemed to me that what we know of the way Adam Bede was published, that Lewis and Blackwood and Eliot herself worked in a way as a kind of unit or a small network, a bit of the sort that Mary Shannon describes. They were geographically separated. Blackwood was in Edinburgh and Lewis and Eliot were in London, but that they worked together to make this such a success. I wondered about Scenes of Clerical Life, where, as you said, Moody didn't take it. And the general reason is usually alleged because it only filled 2 volumes. And that was really Eliot's fault. She got frightened by Blackwood's criticism of Janet's repentance, and so she stopped. Do you think if Scenes had gone to 3 volumes and then had been more widely reviewed and taken up, there were any elements in that might have made it, as even some semblance of the popularity that Adam Bede, or what did she make a step change with Adam Bede, which is why it had this fantastic success?
I think there's something. Scenes of Clerical Life, I think, I heard they look like an apprenticeship to me for Adam Bede in terms of working out, particularly what she's saying about realism. I think possibly people needed Scenes of Clerical Life as that stepping point into something that embeds that realist approach much more fundamentally than Adam Bede. I also think there is my theory about Adam Bede, having read it alongside quite a lot of other novels that come out in 1859, is that she's very cannily using some elements of popular fiction in Adam Bede which he isn't doing in Scenes of Clerical Life. So I think Scenes of Clerical Life is in some ways a much purer articulation of her interests. By the time she gets to Adam Bede, we've got a very well realised, or 2 love triangles really, which we're having to work through. We've got something very sensational at the end, which reviewers were often quite sniffy about, but nonetheless it allows the novel to reach a happy ending, which Scenes of Clerical Life don't generally have. So I think there are ways in which Adam Bede is kind of carrying on the experimentation with realism and forms of fiction that she begins in Scenes of Clerical Life, but there aren't the kind of popular elements that Adam Bede has, which enables that to be the great success that Scenes of Clerical Life weren't. But it's really interesting to think about the 2-volume versus 3-volume aspect of it, which I haven't thought about. So that's and certainly would have affected Moody's willingness to take the volumes on. I think you're absolutely right.
Yes, but I think you're also right that when that letter that I'm not a popular novelist, she shows in Adam Bede that she could become one. I think for the reasons you just said, the sensationalism and the love triangles and so forth.
Yeah.
So thank you.
You're welcome. And the love triangles are very interesting because in every novel I've read from 1859, there is always a love triangle. It's usually the girl who falls for the dissolute but handsome and dashing fella who's not a good bloke in the end, and she ends up with the more solid, respectable Adam-like character. So we've got that in Adam Bede, but we've also got in Adam Bede the fact that it's Adam who falls for the girl who's not going to do the right thing, and then goes and finds his love in Dinah. So it's quite an interesting kind of complication and twist on that kind of trajectory. But what's also interesting, if I can just witcher on a bit about 1859 and other texts, is that I found 2 or 3 novels which actually talk about realism in the way that Eliot's talking about it in chapter 17 in Adam Bede, where they're saying, things don't have to be sugar-coated, we're just trying to tell things as they are, which is really fascinating. And it suggests to me that Scenes of Clerical Life was already having an impact on the writing of fiction, even really before Adam Bede became that well known. So that's very interesting, I think.
Thank you, Joanne. John.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Sort of tentative question, Gail. What about the networks of readers in other countries? I'm thinking particularly of America in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any sort of understanding of that, or is it possible to trace any distinctive kind of networks in the American readership, or again in the European ones when Tauchnitz's editions get underway?
I'm sure it would be. I haven't done that, but it'd be really interesting to find out. I don't know so much about how American networks, so I'm using this quotation marks, how they get constructed, but it would be fascinating. And Tauchnitz, I think, is such an interesting understudied area.
Yeah.
So I can't answer the question, but I think they're great questions and would be really interesting to pursue.
Well, I suppose in the case of Daniel Deronda, we all know that a German rabbi in Frankfurt, David Kaufmann, published a pamphlet, George Eliot and Judaism in German, Das Judentum. And I'm just thinking of networks. One rather, I think, comical episode is that when Wagner and his wife Cosima Wagner were in London, Lewis presented Cosima Wagner with a cosy of David Kaufmann's pamphlet. What he seemed to be unaware of, which we all know now, particularly from her diary, is that Cosima Wagner was a rabid anti-Semite, so she wouldn't probably have taken very much to a little work on George Eliot and Judaism. But I suppose, in a way, Lewis was trying to extend the network of interest somehow by handing that little work onto Wagner's.
Indeed.
But I don't know where that leads.
Yeah.
To a blind alley in that case, I think.
Network it's a really interesting term, and I know that Joanne's written about networks, and I think in a special edition of RSVP, the Victorian Periodicals Review, a special issue about Victorian networks. And it's a very useful term, but I was just really interested to see how the Victorians used it or failed to use it in the ways in which we do. And it's very much bound up with technology, I think, as those initial uses of talking about the TV network demonstrated. Yes,
I thought your demonstration of how the word changes from the literal and the physical to the metaphorical in Eliot's own usage was fascinating. Yeah, that was great.
It's very interesting. Yeah.
Anybody else with a question or a comment?
I've got a bit of a question.
Hello, yes, Margaret.
Yes. We tend to think of the Victorians as prudish and narrow-minded and, disapproving. I and our modern society is being much more open and things, and yet we've got a cancel culture now, and writers are disapproved of, because of something that's gone on in their private life or in their Twitter feed or things like that. I'm just fascinated to hear you talk about Queen Victoria reading it for a second time to her husband, and knowing full well that it was a woman who was living with a man she wasn't married to, who had written this story. And I was just wondering whether there was actually, when it was discovered that it was a woman who'd written this book and she was living with a man she wasn't married to, was there any kind of backlash? Because all the reviews that you've read are all very positive about her work. Was there anything that was sort of backlash and sort of saying you shouldn't read work from this kind of person because she's not a good person?
Well, it is a very interesting story, and it does come out through the course of 1859. So Adam Bede's popularity is already well established before rumours start to circulate, but there are various stages through which that story goes. So Blackwood was quite intent really on keeping her identity secret. He was really worried about what it would do to the reputation of the novel and to sales. In fact, when the story came out, perhaps not surprisingly, sales did really well. So it actually gave the novel a bit of a boost. So I suppose there's a kind of notoriety about Eliot which enabled that to happen. I think the only backlash I've really come upon was in the pages of the Athenaeum, which is quite a straight-laced kind of I don't know to use the term right wing, but it's a straight-laced, very establishment kind of journal, which was very snide, very snippy about Eliot, and the way in which writers like Oliphant talked about her later as writing in a very moral way whilst having this life which didn't seem to fit with what she was writing. So there's a certain snippiness, a snideness there. But and the other thing that was happening, the other great literary scandal that was happening at the time was that John Payne Collier, a Shakespeare editor, was being proved to have faked some annotations in a Shakespeare folio, and the Athenaeum was actually defending him. So there's a way in which they're sort of trying to condemn Eliot and support their own guys. Two quite big literary scandals going on at the time. But apart from that, the only other place where I found a real kind of anxiety about Eliot's reputation and what the outing of her identity might do is to women's literary reputations is in the things that Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Elizabeth Gaskell and I think Mrs. Harriet Martineau actually say in private letters they're very anxious about the mismatch that they see between Eliot's public persona and her private identity, private activities. So there is an anxiety that she's going to bring serious women writers into disrepute, which is kind of both disappointing but also entirely understandable that they might respond like that. So there's a great gamut of responses, great generosity from people like Dickens, and actually even Mrs. Gaskell writes later to Eliot to congratulate her on the continuing success of Adam Bede. She'd written to her earlier not knowing who Eliot was, but when she finds out Eliot's identity, she writes again. And Eliot writes back rather stiffly. She's trying to be jovial, but she's rather stiff, I think. So there's a great range of responses, but I don't think there's anything like the kind of cancel culture, if that exists. So there's not that kind of outright condemnation of her, which is interesting. As you say, the example of Queen Victoria is particularly interesting. A, in carrying on reading Adam Bede, but B, not condemning Hetty and just thinking this is one of those things that happens, which as Victorian newspapers tell us did happen very frequently. But that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gail.
Great answer. Thank you.
I think Jenny Harris has got a question for you. All right, Jenny. You'll need to unmute.
There we go. Can everyone hear me?
You can now.
Yes.
Okay. I have a question about cheese. I think I just reread Adam Bede, oddly, and I didn't know that you'd be speaking about this, but besides, for some reason, I was focusing on Toddy being a complete monster this time. I was startled at how many mentions of cows and cheese and butter there are. And I just did a quick search. Dinah even mentions cows and God in her first sermon, which I think is interesting. And we all know, of course, that George Eliot managed the dairy at her dad's place. But what I'm interested in is feminism in cheese. Mrs. Poyser at one point says that she provides 1/4 of the income from her dairy, and it seems as if she's running her dairy in such a way that she's driven. There's so many mentions of her, or she mentions it, or other people, where she's constantly marketing herself in a way. And she seems driven to do it in the same way that Dinah is driven to sermonizing. And this is why it's cheese and feminism. It's interesting to me that Eliot throws in this little soupçon of feminism. Both of Adam Bede at the end tells Dinah that we can get married, but you can still preach. That's his caveat. It's his little caveat. And she's not so sure if that's going to work. But Mrs. Poyser is certainly part of this income, of this family continuing there for many more generations. And I wondered what Victorian writers would have thought about that. I mean, I just want to throw in one weird thing about Middlemarch. We know that many people disliked it, at least in Britain. In America, they didn't seem to grok onto this, but they didn't like that Will Ladislaw did not have a job at the end of the novel. They thought that was ridiculous. Yeah. So they are paying attention to these things, and I'm wondering what they would have thought, that Mrs. Poyser is part of this economic engine, and that Dinah has been told that she could continue to preach if she wants, her job, her occupation.
Once we look beyond the middle class woman, most women in fiction will have worked. So I think Mrs. Poyser's activity isn't surprising. I think it's really interesting that you've talked about it, because it does, when you, as soon as you mention it, it really does stand out. So I think it's important because it gives her, I wonder if it's kind of legitimizes the language that she uses in some ways. So her authority is underpinned by that financial authority that her work gives her, and it enables her to have that voice, particularly when she's speaking to the squire so brilliantly. So I think that's very interesting to think about. I think the other thing I'd say is that at this point, when people are moving increasingly into the cities, there is quite a big literature about small holdings, about practical instructions for how to run your own small holding, how to try and survive on the land. So it's kind of interesting that we're getting these kind of quite practical instruction books alongside a novel, which is treating it as a form of kind of rural nostalgia, but which is something that's still very present. I suppose we're thinking about it, you might be getting first or second generation people living in cities within whose family there would be very immediate memories of this kind of very active domestic work by women. And I suppose Mrs. Poyser is interesting because we actually see more of her and Hetty's work on the farm than we do that of the men, because we actually see the farmhouse, and that's where their pastoral work takes place, as opposed to the fields, which we don't really
Right,
go
we don't get
very
anything.
often. Yeah, that's really, really interesting question. Eliot and cheese.
Well, I just want to point out one final thing. The reason I started to notice it is because until now, Mansfield Park and their cream cheeses at Southerton used to make me hungrier than anything. But now, of course, it's Adam Bede. So I just thought it was interesting. And I think it's because it's a fresh milk cheese that you can easily make and you can sell that same day. But it's strange that it shows up at Southerton as well. The housekeeper's specialty.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny. I remember, I'm sure some of you here this afternoon will remember a talk from Catherine Hughes. And when Catherine was doing research for her Victorians Undone, she decided, in the interests of realism in her writing, she was trying to work out why it was that Isaac's oldest son, Frederick Evans, and his daughter were both very anxious that this story of George Eliot's right hand or right arm being thicker than her left was squashed. And Catherine has done some absolutely fascinating research. But the reason I'm mentioning this is that Catherine went on a course, a weekend course, in how to, in dairy treatment and being a dairymaid. And she was completely exhausted, didn't finish the course because she'd had enough. But one of the things that she said really was that it was such hard work, and that wherever you went for a day or so afterwards, there was this smell around of the dairy. But it was just typically Catherine that she tells stories like that so well. Many of you, I'm sure, have got the chat option on, and you'll see a lovely comment. Thank you from Rosemary Donaldson, and from Hemmings Bassett. Greetings from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, which is one of the great things about being able to do this, isn't it? Is there anybody else who has a comment or a question?
There's actually a question from Ken Harris, which is up there, which I think is sent to me rather than to the group. So Ken writes, was the reaction to Adam Bede what she wanted? It hardly seems it could have been more enthusiastic, but was it something she was able to receive? Was she open to the fellowship or temperamentally prohibited from appreciating that reaction? I think she would have been delighted at how popular the novel was. And we know that she was particularly appreciative of the review in Blackwood's magazine itself, which is a great review. I think she appreciated the one in the Times. I think who wouldn't be delighted? I mean, we know that she was very sensitive to bad reviews and that Lewis tried to protect her from them. But I suppose your question about whether she was open to the fellowship is quite interesting, because I suppose there's a way in which she still wasn't able to be that kind of publicly accepted into a broader fellowship of writers. So maybe that's the reviews are the ways in which she can participate in that network, even though she couldn't physically go along to the writers' dinners and social events. And Juliet's asking do we have any information on how the publishers of Romola promoted the novel, as it wasn't very well received. I don't have information. I don't know if Joanne or John have any more information about that. It's obviously published
Certainly,
by...
the thing about Romola surely was that it was published by George Smith, who did his damnedest to make it popular, but wasn't successful. And that was one of the reasons eventually that brought Eliot back to John Blackwood. So yeah. Romola is an anomalous, I think, in an otherwise story of greater and greater success.
Mm-hmm. It's a very anomalous book in lots of ways, isn't it? Yeah.
I was fascinated, Gail, by your talking of the publication of Adam Bede, how you brought out how skillful Lewis and George Eliot and Blackwood were in organizing the marketing of it. And we tend to think of marketing as a much more modern idea, but they somehow managed to get it sewn up with Moody's. And I hadn't realized how powerful and influential Moody's were. Mm-hmm. Again, we tend to think of publishers having to almost pay Tesco's to stock their books, or Waterstones charging extra to publishers so that the books are on display. But it was all going on in the 1850s too, wasn't it? There was this sort of really complicated system of getting books out there and getting public attention for them.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, the fact that Judith Flanders cites that Moody's bought 100,000 books. I mean, we know we've got millions of books coming out now, but even 100,000 books is quite difficult to kind of negotiate when you think about how few people would have had access to those books, being able to buy them or even read them. So it's a very big market even then. And that's only the books that came out as in novel form. Obviously, the newspapers and periodicals will all have been producing their own fiction too. So fiction is a massive, massive market at this time. Yeah. Well, John's got a comment, I think.
Yeah, I'm just wondering on the subject of marketing, what effect the two paintings that Queen Victoria commissioned of scenes from Adam Bede, how they were received, and whether that would have, created another kind of range of readers, or another kind of range of interest, at any rate, in the book.
I'm not sure. I can't remember, John, when they were done. It wasn't immediately, was it?
I suppose it wasn't. No, there would have been some time lag, and I'm
Yeah.
not quite
I
sure
think it
how
was
long it is.
1861.
Sorry?
I think it was
61.
1861.
Okay.
Oh, 2 years later. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
so-
I mean, they were quite popular, weren't they? I think they were reproduced.
But I suppose that by that time, Adam Bede had established itself as a kind of modern classic, and so this would have confirmed rather than maybe reach new people. Yeah.
Yeah, so they've been well onto Mill on the Floss and Silas Marner by then. Yeah.
Anybody else with a hand up or a point to raise?
David Peterson, I think.
Yes, I wondered whether we have any information on these successful sales. How far was it a countrywide success, a provincial success, a London metropolitan success, a city success, or is there any information about that kind of targeted information about sales?
I don't know. We've got the numbers of the sales for each edition, but I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't seen geographical distributions. I suppose what I would say is that the reviews are really well distributed. So a lot of the reviews I was looking at today were from local papers as well as London-based papers. But I don't know. I don't know if anybody else knows anything about the sales and how they were spread out. I'm not sure I've seen. That's a brilliant question. I haven't seen information about that. I'll try and find out. I'm now intrigued by that.
I suspect that 1859, it's a very mixed picture, and there's a terrific, there's still millions of people in provincial, rural, agricultural areas that read the technicalities of milk and butter making with great interest.
Yeah, but I suppose, you know, the speech I quoted from George Howard, which was to the workers in Saddleworth, suggesting that actually they might have access. I don't think that's fanciful thinking on his part, but certainly institutes, working men's institutes throughout the country would have been buying solid literature like Adam Bede for people to borrow. So certainly in places which had a significant body of population that actually could support something like a working men's institute, we might suppose that they would have access to Adam Bede. But perhaps deep in the country, it might have been more difficult for people to get hold of texts like that. That's a really interesting question.
This isn't sort of helpful in terms of where in the country, but it's always pointed out that Blackwood honed a particular technique with Adam Bede of bringing out several 3-volume editions and then reducing it to a 2-volume edition, which sold for 12 shillings instead of 31 and 6, and then a 6-shilling edition. And that would have widened, I'd have thought, the readership substantially.
Yeah. I think Anthea's just put a comment in the chat. She says, I've been thinking a lot during your talk about network, web and fellowship, and wonder how you see the impact of recent days on our understanding of these words. To what extent do you think openness and closed are relevant? And I suppose, I mean, partly, you know, having read Mary's book a while ago, the idea of the network has taken on a much greater significance very recently. And I suppose I was kind of thinking about the more sinister aspects of it in having watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix recently. I don't know if anybody's seen it. It was the most terrifying thing, actually, about the ways in which our networked brains, because we're so used to working on screens, in particular networks that are being manipulated, it's actually changing the way we think. But it did make me think about the ways in which some of the same fears were articulated about reading fiction in the 1850s and 1860s, and how that was actually quite bad for you, and it might kind of ruin you morally or make you a more frivolous person. So I suppose there's always been an anxiety about new technologies, new forms of communication. But ultimately, I suppose I'd suggest that Eliot is getting us to engage with each other in ways which are less pernicious than Facebook these days. But yeah, it's a really interesting question, Anthea. I think it's, you know, these are terms which are accruing meaning the more we continue with them.
Anybody else with a comment or a question? Right.
Yeah, that really was fascinating.
Oh, thank you very
Yeah,
much.
that's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gail.
Oh,
Yes,
thank
thank
you.
you.
On
Great.
Saturday
Thank you.
afternoon, isn't it?
Thank you.
And it's very nice to see you, even if we can't be in the same room together. Can I just say thank you very much to Mary, who's, as I say, my colleague at Reading, who is not a Victorianist at all. She's a very distinguished early modern scholar, and it's particularly kind of her to be here with us this afternoon. Thank you, Mary.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a great comfort to me that both Mary and Gail knew a great deal more about
Well done, John.
learning fast. I think it's been a fascinating experience, actually. Quite different from sitting in a room and listening to people, but equally valid and really interesting. Fascinating listening to Gail and also seeing the questions and hearing the questions and comments that have been able to come from around the world, which is marvelous. It really is. So on behalf of us all, Gail, you have been the first of our long series of Zoom-inspired lectures for the fellowship, and thank you all who have taken part and have come along to the screen to share the screen. Any other comments, if you want to email them to me or send them to the website, that would be wonderful. So on behalf of us all, Gail, thank you for a fascinating talk.
Thank you, John, for organising it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the